Greetings, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and call us to order. Welcome to everyone who is joining us both in person and online for this Election Matters 2026 panel, the battle over mid-decade redistricting. My name is Rob Yablon. I'm a professor here at UW Law School. Together with Professor Miriam Seifter, I co-direct the law school's State Democracy Research Initiative, which aims to foster research and dialogue on state-level democracy and public law in Wisconsin and around the country. SDRI is co-hosting this event with the university's terrific Elections Research Center. Our Elections Matters series is generously sponsored by the law firm Stafford Rosenbaum. In a moment, I'll turn things over to Erin Deely, who is a partner at Stafford, and she will introduce today's panel. Before that, though, let me just do some very quick initial housekeeping. First, this event is approved for 1.5 Wisconsin CLE credits by the Board of Bar Examiners. For those of you here in person, if you want CLE credit, there are CLE sign-in sheets at the registration table just inside the room. If you haven't already signed in, please make sure to do so before you leave today. For those of you attending virtually, please listen for the passcode that I will give around 4:05 p.m. Central Time. We will provide a link to a Google form in the webinar chat box at that time. Complete that form with the correct passcode by 8 p.m. today to get your CLE credit, and then the panel will wrap up around 4:50. Yeah. Second, we do plan to leave some time for moderated Q&A. If you're here in person, please use the index cards that have been left on the tables in front of you to write any questions you have. If you're joining us virtually, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. Oh, and by the way, if you're in the room, someone will come around to collect those, so just feel free to hold them up. I'm going to keep an eye on what's submitted both in person and virtually, and I'll do my best to kind of combine and synthesize questions for efficiency so we can squeeze as much in as possible. Finally, a huge thank you to our wonderful SDRI team and also the law school's excellent tech team for all of their work to make this event happen. And so with that, let me turn it over to Erin for introductions.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Deely. I am partner at Stafford Rosenbaum. We're a full-service firm in Milwaukee and Madison. I'm also co-team leader of our election and political law team. We're really excited to be sponsoring this series again this year. This program every year brings essential, important information to the entire community, lawyers, non-lawyers alike, and it's so excited to see such participation on a really happy day. So thank you all for braving the weather. Let's get to introductions. We have online Professor Sara Sadhwani. Professor Sara Sadhwani is an assistant professor of politics at Pomona College, specializing in Asian American and Latino voting behavior, elections, voting rights, public opinion, public policy, and interest groups. Her research has been published in the Journal of Politics, Political Behavior, and Political Research Quarterly, and her analysis of elections has been featured in the Washington Post, CNN, NPR, Bloomberg, Politico, and more. She is commissioner on the Citizens Redistricting Commission of California, and she earned her BA from the Honors College at the University of Pittsburgh and her PhD at the University of Southern California. And then in the middle here, we have Michael Lee. Michael Lee is senior counsel in the Brennan Center's democracy program, focusing on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. He was formerly executive director of B1 Texas, a donor alliance that oversaw strategic and targeted investments into nonprofit organizations working to increase voter participation and engagement in historically disadvantaged Black and Latino communities. He has appeared on PBS NewsHour, MSNBC, USA Today, and NPR, among others. He earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Texas at Austin and JD from Tulane. And then at the end, we have Nick Stephanopoulos. Professor Nick Stephanopoulos is a professor of law at Harvard Law School and the director of strategy at Harvard's Election Law Clinic. His research interests include election, constitutional, administrative, and comparative law, with a particular focus on the intersection of democratic theory, empirical
political science, and the American electoral system. He is the author of Aligning Election Law and a co-author of the casebook Election Law Cases and Materials with Dean Takashi. His work has appeared in the Columbia Law Review, Northwestern University Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Yale Law Review, as well as the Times, Washington Post, Atlantic, Slate, and more. He earned his undergraduate degree from Harvard and master's from the University of Cambridge and his JD from Yale. And that was a huge mouthful, which I think means we're in for a really, really great conversation. Thank you all once again.
Erin, thanks so much to our panelists for joining us. So in terms of format, the plan is for me to spend about 5 minutes setting the stage, introducing our topic. And then after I lay that groundwork, I'm going to invite each panelist to dive deeper and offer opening remarks of about 6 to 8 minutes. After that, I have a couple of questions that I'll ask of the panelists, and then we'll open things up for full Q&A. So in terms of introduction, we expect to see electoral district lines redrawn every 10 years following the decennial federal census. Now, it's not unusual for redistricting fights, particularly courtroom fights, to persist well into the decade. Some of you will recall that here in Wisconsin, we had mid-decade federal court litigation in the 2010s over whether our state legislative maps were unlawfully gerrymandered. Similar federal partisan gerrymandering litigation played out in other states as well, until the U.S. Supreme Court shut the door in Rucho versus Common Cause, holding that partisan gerrymandering claims are simply not justiciable in federal court. In the 2020s, we've again seen rampant redistricting litigation. The majority of states have had at least one legal challenge to their congressional maps, their state legislative maps, or both. Although Rucho put an end to federal partisan gerrymandering litigation, it left the door open to state constitutional challenges to partisan gerrymandering, and several dozen such cases have been brought in state courts around the country. That includes litigation about Wisconsin's congressional map, which remains pending right now at the state trial level, and I think Nick in particular will have more to say about that. There have also been dozens of cases challenging maps around the country as racial gerrymanders, as violations of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is a federal statute that prevents map makers from diluting the voting strength of racial and ethnic minorities. I suspect that our panelists will have more to say about Section 2 and whether it is likely to survive a pending U.S. Supreme Court challenge. And there have been an array of other state law challenges. In Wisconsin, as many of you know, the state Supreme Court rejected our initial post-2020 state legislative maps, not because they were gerrymandered, but because dozens of the districts were not geographically contiguous. Following that ruling, the legislature and the governor agreed on new maps for 2024, and those are the maps that will remain in place this fall. But beyond all of that litigation, which again is not something unique to the 2020s, we have seen something new and different in recent months. A spate of politically motivated mid-decade efforts to redraw congressional districts. This began last summer when President Trump pushed Texas, which already had a Republican-friendly map, to tweak its lines to try to gain 5 more Republican seats and help Republicans retain their razor-thin House majority this fall. Texas's decision to redistrict triggered a response from California. Because California has a nonpartisan redistricting process with an independent commission, this actually required the state to amend its constitution, which California voters did by a wide margin last November. And I think that's something that we'll hear more about from Sara in particular. Although both the Texas and California redraws certainly had partisan objectives, both maps were quickly challenged in federal court as racial gerrymanders, with the litigants arguing that the map makers improperly focused on the racial and ethnic compositions of several of the new districts they created. In Texas, a federal district court found that the state had in fact engaged in unlawful racial gerrymandering and put the new map on hold. But the U.S. Supreme Court then stepped in and stayed that decision, allowing Texas to use its new map, which it did just earlier this week in its primary elections. In California, a federal district court rejected the racial gerrymandering claim. The challengers then went to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court declined to intervene, effectively giving the green light for California to use its new map as well. Meanwhile, a number of other states have gotten in on the action. North Carolina redrew its map in an effort to produce another Republican-leaning district. Missouri did the same, although that continues to be litigated. Ohio will have a new map this fall that could yield 2 additional Republican seats. In Florida, Governor DeSantis is trying to call a special legislative session next month to redistrict, although there's a controversy about whether he has the authority to do that. On the flip side, Virginians are about to vote on a redistricting ballot measure that would potentially create 4 new Democratic-leaning districts in that state. Maryland has been considering whether to create another Democratic-leaning district there. Utah, through litigation, should have a new Democratic-leaning district this fall. And finally, in New York, a state court held that the state constitution required a district currently held by a Republican to be redrawn in order to avoid diluting the voting power of Black and Latino voters. That new district would likely have elected a Democrat this fall, but earlier this week, the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and stayed that ruling. Now, we still don't know exactly how things will shake out once all the dust settles, but it's possible that after all of this tit-for-tat redistricting, everything will kind of cancel out, and neither party will gain much of a net national advantage. Individual states, however, may end up with results that more disproportionately favor one party or the other, and perhaps will have fewer competitive districts than before. So we clearly have a lot to talk about. And so with that background, I will now turn things over to the panelists, and we'll start with Sara, who's joining us online.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure. And I apologize. I had hoped to join you all in person. But I'm still glad to be here, even though I'm virtual. Thank you for that great introduction and kind of lay of the land. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences here in California. And in particular, I'll take on about 4 different areas. First, I'll talk a little bit about the process of independent redistricting in the state of California. I'll talk about the question I always get asked, why a redistricting commissioner would support Prop 50 and support a clear partisan gerrymander. Talk a little bit about how Prop 50 proceeded in California, including the Voting Rights Act litigation against it. And then I'll just talk briefly at the end about some of the key races that we're seeing here in California, given these new maps. So just to start off, and for those who are unaware, California has actually been operating an independent redistricting commission since the 2010 redistricting cycle, the 2010 census. A proposition was passed on the California ballot back in 2008. The Voters First Act, which removed the power from the California state legislature to redraw the lines, and instead put that power into the hands of a citizen commission. There are a number of provisions as to how the commission is selected, and I'm happy to go through that if there's questions about it. But essentially, all of those pieces were written into the California state constitution, as well as ranked criteria that we have to use as commissioners when line drawing, first and second amongst those being the federal requirements of equal population and adherence to the Voting Rights Act. When I was selected in 2020 to serve on the state's redistricting commission, it was, of course, a very unique and interesting time. It was the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant that as commissioners, we were doing our work remotely. We didn't have the opportunity to meet in person. It's a 14-member commission, which is comprised of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents. And so you can imagine in that moment, it's also a presidential election year. Spirits were high. We didn't know whether or not to trust one another. It was very difficult to develop a sense of rapport working online in that way. But certainly over the course of that year and a half, we became very close as commissioners and ultimately worked to pass the maps unanimously. That's something you don't see very often in American politics today, to see a round of Democrats and Republicans actually working collaboratively and passing something unanimously. My position on the commission was, of course, as a commissioner, but also as a rotating chair of the commission, as well as the chair of our VRA compliance subcommittee. So myself and a Republican colleague ensured, hiring outside counsel to advise us on the Voting Rights Act, as well as ensuring our analysis. When we're thinking about the VRA, oftentimes we think about this as a post-map activity. When there is a problem, when communities see that their vote has been diluted, a lawsuit entails. In the instance of an independent redistricting commission, especially given the type of commission we had in California, where we had a number of commissioners who came from community-based organizations or were very much rooted in communities across California, we really took an affirmative approach to the Voting Rights Act and looked at what our obligation truly was. And in that regard, we expanded our Voting Rights Act districts exponentially by doing the analysis necessary to really understand the changes in the state's demographics. California, as you might be aware, has a very large Latino population. Nearly 40% of California's population is Latino. And in many regards, many analysts have long believed that both in previous redistricting with legislators, but also with the first commission, who really wanted to be successful and not rock the boat too much, that Latinos in particular had lost out on opportunities to elect the candidates of their choice. I think one of the pieces for myself, many people didn't know, I had just finished my political science program, my PhD in political science. None of my publications were out from my dissertation. And so after I had been selected to the commission, many of them started to come out. And what people came to realize, though it had always been public knowledge, was that as a part of my dissertation, I had been conducting ecological inference up and down the state of California, particularly looking at the voting behavior of Latino and Asian Americans throughout the state. So that was something I took with a whole lot of seriousness when I was selected to serve on the commission. And certainly we conducted a significant amount of analysis, probably more than ever had been done before, throughout the state of California. And it led to an increase in Voting Rights Act districts and the congressional districts, an increase of 7 Latino, what we identified as being VRA compliant districts, for a total of 16 majority minority Latino seats. And in the state assembly, an increase of 5 additional VRA designated seats, for a total of 22. There were also 2 Asian American Assembly majority minority seats. And I say all of that because as we move towards Prop 50, I did come out in support of it actually very early on actually prior to the announcement of Prop 50. It was reported that I had said that there would be, if it was done in such a way that the voters of California had a say, that I could get behind it and approve of it because of the actions of the state of Texas. Prop 50, when it was first introduced, and I was there a part of the introduction of the proposition, was polling under 50%. And as was laid out in the opening comments, it ultimately passed overwhelmingly of California voters weighing in Position 50. What it did was indeed a partisan gerrymander, and it specifically gerrymandered 5 seats that had been held by Republicans previously. And I should note, it also solidified districts that were highly competitive. One of the pieces that I think were the Independent Redistricting Commission is the fact that prior to Prop 50, California had some of the most competitive seats in the nation. And it's certainly sad to see that has gone away. Ideally, we would have competitive seats all over the country, but as we are very well aware, that is not the case anymore, and definitely slipping through our fingers. After Prop 50 was passed, and I'm sure that Nick and Michael will talk a little bit more about the cases themselves, but it was a lawsuit brought on VRA charges of thinking about the Voting Rights Act, in part because the map maker who drew the new map had made a lot of comments about having a keen eye towards Latino districts. Ultimately, that lawsuit was thrown out by by federal courts. finding no evidence of race consciousness. And I would have to believe in part because the current maps in many ways maintained the districts that we had already drawn by the commission. I think previously it was stated that typically redistricting litigation goes well into the middle of the decade and beyond sometimes. Notably in California, the largest state in the nation with 52 congressional seats, our redistricting commission had 0 lawsuits against us. In fact, the only one lawsuit that was brought against the commission was prior to the adoption of our maps, trying to stop us from moving that forward. That lawsuit was actually brought by the former head of the California Republican Party, Harmeet Dillon, who is also serving as the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, who was also a part of this lawsuit. So twice she has tried to sue the maps in California, and twice has been denied. What's on looking ahead for California, those 5 seats that were redrawn, certainly there are still competitive seats amongst them. While they favor Democrats are going to have to do their work to really go out and connect with voters if they want to win them. One up in the very top area of California, District 1, actually the congressman from there actually recently passed away, so it's technically an open seat at this point. The 3rd District of California, Kevin Kiley, notably had brought legislation in California to stop redistricting from happening nationwide, which certainly is something I would have supported as well. That district Kevin Kiley is interesting. He's actually running in a separate district in 2026 this year. In the Central Valley, David Valadeo's seat is actually now considered a toss-up. That had been a very competitive seat. That is also a Latino majority seat as well. Two Republicans were combined into one district, Young Kim and Ken Calvert. So they will be battling it out in certainly a Republican stronghold district. And finally, down in northern San Diego County, the seat held by Darrell Issa now leans towards the Democratic Party, though certainly that will continue to be a competitive race. I will stop there and hand it off to the others on the panel, but happy to be available for questions.
Great. Thank you, Sara, for that. And I think, as I said, we're going to go to Nick next.
Great. Thanks very much, Rob, and also SDRI and Stafford for organizing this panel. I've been coming to Madison for both academic and litigation purposes for more than a decade. And so it's always a pleasure to be here, even in the middle of a rainstorm. So I'm going to talk about some of the partisan dynamics of this cycle's spate of mid-decade redistricting. And then I'll also say a few words about some litigation over Wisconsin's current congressional map. So as Rob mentioned, we've seen an unprecedented number of states voluntarily redraw their congressional maps over the last year or so. 5 states, by my count, have done this so far: California, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, and Texas. We're also likely to see voluntary remaps in Florida and Virginia. And then depending on what happens in the Calais case that Michael will talk about potentially, we may see even more voluntary mid-decade redistricting all across the South. And if we don't see it before 2026, we'll certainly see it before 2028 if Calais is the maximal decision that some are anticipating. So first, I want to stress that this is all truly unprecedented. It may be the most discretionary mid-decade redistricting that we've ever seen. It's certainly the most that has occurred since the Gilded Age, since the late 19th century. So political scientist Eric Engstrom has a great book about redistricting in the 1870s, 1880s. It looked an awful lot like redistricting in 2025, 2026. Numerous states redrew their congressional maps between censuses. Ohio at one point redrew its congressional map for every single election for 4 or 5 elections in a row. so maybe even exceeding current records for mid-decade redistricting. But crucially, that kind of mid-decade activity stopped as of roughly the 1890s and basically didn't resume until the last year or so. Texas redrew its congressional district lines in the 2000s in a famous incident. But that was close to the only voluntary case of mid-decade congressional redistricting for many years. So we are in either completely uncharted territory now, or at least we're in a kind of world that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age more than a century ago. Now, second point is having now shattered this norm against mid-decade redistricting, it's highly unclear to me if there's any way to rebuild this norm. And that's because partisans on both sides have now seen that mid-decade redistricting offers them additional bites at the apple, ways to squeeze out more seats out of a given state. And so having glimpsed this potential, I don't think there's any voluntary going back. And so I think this is, quite unfortunate that a desirable norm that held for 100 years is now gone with no real prospect of reviving this norm. Now, that sounds pretty gloomy. On the other hand, and Rob also alluded to this, the aggregate effects of all of this mid-decade redistricting seem pretty minimal. So I'm involved with a website called planscore.org that I encourage you all to visit. PlanScore assesses the likely partisan performance of congressional and state legislative district maps around the country. And based on PlanScore's estimates, after all of the voluntary redrawing that's gone on, the US House as a whole is essentially perfectly balanced in partisan terms. It might be more perfectly balanced right now than it has been at any point over the last half century or so. Why is this the case? Well, we had quite a fair US House map in aggregate heading into the current round of mid-decade redrawing. And then the new gerrymanders that have been adopted around the country have largely offset one another. And so they've given us, in the aggregate, this nearly perfectly balanced US House map. So I do think at the aggregate level, which may be the most important level of analysis, we shouldn't be terribly alarmed over this mid-decade redistricting. Now, on the other hand, we also care about state-level consequences of redistricting. And these remaps do have some negative state-level effects. So representation in places like California or Texas is now really dramatically distorted by gerrymandering. California is a blue state, but its electorate is nothing like 48 Democrats to 4 Republicans. Which is the likely composition of California's congressional delegation after the next election. Texas is, a pale red state, but it's not nearly as red as the 30 Republican to 8 Democrat composition of the Texas delegation that's likely after 2026. Beyond skewing state-level representation, this mid-decade redistricting has been eliminating the already relatively limited number of competitive districts in these states. What's the easiest way to make a map more advantageous to your side? Get rid of competitive districts and turn them into safe districts for your side. And so I think we're likely to see a further decrease in competitiveness and thereby in accountability because of this mid-decade redrawing. And it's kind of a coincidence that mid-decade redrawing has basically canceled out this time around. There's no guarantee it'll always cancel out. And the potential is there with this technique that it could substantially skew the overall balance of power in Washington instead of preserving a balanced U.S. House. And so for all those reasons, I think we shouldn't be too complacent just because this particular bout of mid-decade redistricting doesn't seem to have caused big problems in the aggregate. Okay, so if mid-decade redistricting is a problem, what should we do about it? I think Sara mentioned that a California Republican congressman who's been affected by the California remap has proposed just banning mid-decade redistricting specifically. And that would be a sort of narrow surgical response to this exact problem. Now, the concern with that approach is that a mid-decade gerrymander is only ever so slightly more problematic than a beginning of decade gerrymander. So it'd be kind of odd to say that you can't gerrymander in 2024 or 2026, but you could gerrymander as aggressively as you want in 2022. That would be an odd state of affairs. And so I think the more compelling response to recent events is to try to prohibit gerrymandering across the board. And there were bills in front of Congress in 2021, 2022 that Michael and I both worked on that would have done exactly that. So the two conventional legislative methods for curbing gerrymandering are one, to transfer map-making authority from politicians to independent commissions, or two, to enact some kind of statutory limit on partisan gerrymandering, either by banning line drawing with the intent of benefiting one side, or by adopting a certain quantitative threshold on how much partisan bias is permissible in a district map. And the bills in 2021, 2022 adopted both of those strategies at different points. And so I think those bills are more a compelling template for reform, in my view, than only surgically restricting mid-decade redistricting. Okay, so I have more thoughts about the national scene, but let me, for just a couple minutes, talk about Wisconsin before I pass the baton to Michael. Wisconsin's current congressional plan, as some of you probably know, was adopted by the state Supreme Court after the elected branches deadlocked in 2021, 2022. The plan that the court ultimately selected was the governor's plan, was chosen because it minimized changes to the congressional plan that was in effect in the 2010s. Now, that 2010s congressional plan, unlike the 2010s state legislative plans, was basically a deal or a compromise between Democrats and Republicans. So the 2010s plan insulated all of the then incumbents, both the Democrats and the Republicans. The plan didn't try to flip any districts at all from Republican to Democratic or vice versa. It was a classic bipartisan incumbent protecting map. And so those same properties have carried over to the current congressional plan. It's a highly, highly uncompetitive plan. The median margin of victory under the plan has been something like 30 percentage points, which is a massive blowout by any measure. Only one district in the plan has been reasonably competitive. That's Congressional District 3. And if you ask a computer to spit out thousands of maps for Wisconsin for you, virtually none of those computer-produced maps are ever as uncompetitive as the enacted congressional plan. So for these reasons, the case that I'm involved with argues that the current congressional plan is an anti-competitive gerrymander that violates various provisions of Wisconsin's state constitution. And so note that this is distinct from a partisan gerrymandering claim, right? The claim is not that the current plan is favoring Republicans or Democrats. The claim is that the current plan is improperly squeezing out competition from the electoral system as a whole. And that's a different argument than complaining about partisan advantage or disadvantage. In recent years, there have been a lot more partisan gerrymandering claims than anti-competitive gerrymandering claims, but there have been a few of the latter, and this Wisconsin case fits into that small but growing category. And procedurally, motions to dismiss are currently pending in the case. Assuming that the suit isn't dismissed, we'll head into discovery. And so there's no prospect of any relief in this case by 2026. This is on a longer time frame that, if the case is successful, may affect the 2028 election rather than the next election. And so that I'll subside and I'll pass the floor to Michael.
Great. Thank you for having me here, and glad to be part of this great panel. So I'm going to talk about another big piece of the story, which is the fight for fair representation for communities of color. And this is, of course, not something that is new. It's something that is longstanding and been going on for a great many years, but it is something that in a lot of ways is coming to a head. In coming weeks, the Supreme Court is expected to issue its opinion in a case called Louisiana versus Calais, which will decide whether key remaining provisions of the Voting Rights Act remain constitutional. And, you know, that depending on what it says, it could have a devastating impact for communities of color, especially in the South. And importantly, this fight comes at a time that the country really, in a lot of ways, is at a demographic tipping point. In every region of the country, except for the South and in the mountain states, the white population has started to fall in absolute numbers. Then that is to say, not as a percentage, but also just in raw numbers as the country ages. And even in states like Texas and Georgia, the white population has started to decrease. And this is likely only to accelerate in coming years because if older Americans are disproportionately white, and as they sort of leave the scene, the people who remain are much more diverse, and so you can expect the diversity of the country to increase. But at the same time, we have a very racially aligned politics in many places, again, especially in the South, and that also makes it very efficient if you're a map drawer wanting to achieve an advantage either for your party or your group, to use voters of color as the tool to get there. And the reason for that is that because of continued residential segregation, it is very easy to break apart communities of color or pack them together in order to move the partisan valence of a map up or down. There certainly are white Democrats even in the South. The challenge for trying to use white Democrats, if you're a Republican map drawer or a Democratic map drawer for that matter, is that white Democrats tend to live near white Republicans, sometimes in the same houses, and sometimes they even share a bed. And that makes things very hard unless you're going to draw the line down somebody's bed and divide it that way. It's just much easier to target communities of color. And unfortunately, these fights are coming at a time that the courts are increasingly skeptical of the remedies that we have. And there are traditionally three remedies that you have for getting at this kind of discrimination. Now that you can't use partisan gerrymandering anymore, at least at the federal level, you have to bring race-based claims. And there are three, really. One is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which in certain instances, if you meet really rigorous requirements, can require you to draw a majority-minority district or something close to it. There also are challenges that map drawers, race predominated in the minds of map drawers when they drew the map. That's something called a racial gerrymander. And there also are claims for intentional discrimination. And those are really powerful tools, and all of them have been used in recent years to great effect. But increasingly, courts, and especially the U.S. Supreme Court, is is becoming skeptical of those, and in part because the Supreme Court has tended to see everything through the lens of politics. Isn't it all just politics? And this is certainly what states have argued. Like Texas, they have argued like, oh, no, we weren't discriminating against Black and Latino voters. We were just discriminating against Democrats. And the fact that they happen to be Black and Latino, that's just sort of a side effect of our desire to discriminate against Democrats. And the Supreme Court seems to buy into that increasingly, and that you see that play out in intent claims. People are like, oh no, they were discriminating because of race. They were just discriminating on the basis of politics, and that's okay. In racial gerrymandering, no, race didn't predominate in the minds of map drawers. Politics predominated. And in Section 2, we may see the Supreme Court, in this case called Calais, do a maneuver where they basically require litigants to untangle whether it was race or party that motivated voters when they voted, or motivated map drawers when they drew the map. And, I always tell people, in a lot of ways, that is a very false binary. It's unfortunately one that the Supreme Court has bought. But, it's either it's race or it's politics. It's not somehow a fusion of both. But that's the world that we live in. And so, I'll add to that the Supreme Court, in cases like the Harvard affirmative action case, SFA, has increasingly taken a view that our Constitution is colorblind and that we really can't remedy racial discrimination very, very much. And so that's sort of the world that we live in. And so what can we do in this? And as Nick talked about, like, Congress certainly had a chance to fix this back in 2022, 2021, 2022. And it came really achingly close to being able to do so. The two bills, the Freedom to Vote Act, which would have banned partisan gerrymandering and established uniform rules for congressional redistricting, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would have updated and modernized the Voting Rights Act, passed the House. And had enough votes to pass in the Senate, but what it didn't have is enough votes to either overcome the filibuster or enough support to do a narrow carve out to the filibuster to allow the bills to come for an up or down vote. And that was really two senators, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, both of whom are no longer there. Of course, in this dysfunctional Congress, it doesn't seem likely that any of those things will happen in response to Calais or any of the other things that are going on. But that, you might be there sooner than you think. I will say, as we're at this moment, well, you know who I am. I do think, this year is the 250th anniversary of our national independence. About 250 years ago, I think in April, John Adams wrote his thoughts on government in response to Thomas Paine, and he talks about how the ideal legislature should be an exact portrait, a miniature of the people as a whole. And that really is a pretty good statement of what we want out of sort of our representational systems. If your interests are at the table, you should also be at the table. And we have to think about how we do that, because right now across the country, we use a system by and large of single member districts, in the case of Congress, relatively large single member districts. And that may not quite be fitted for the country anymore as we go forward, in part because even for people of color, most people of color now, and this really surprises a lot of people when I tell them this, is that most people of color in the country's metro areas live in the suburbs, not in the cities anymore. And it's hard to draw these majority-minority districts sort of in the suburbs. A lot of sort of, the Section 2 framework was built, what Justice Brennan wrote, the test for this back in the 1980s. He was thinking back to the 1960s and the way that politics worked in the South in the 1960s. And in a lot of ways, it doesn't quite fit us anymore. So, this is an opportunity for us to think outside the box about whether there are different ways to achieve representation. And I know that there are efforts around the country to explore things like proportional representation. We at the Brennan Center have not endorsed that, but we think it's an important conversation to have, because in a lot of ways, it might solve a lot of these problems. And indeed, when it comes to partisan gerrymandering, it's very hard to gerrymander a proportional representation system. So, I would just encourage people, as you think about this, to be willing to sort of explore things and think outside the box. So,
excellent. Well, thank you for those remarks. So if you are in the room, please do write those questions on your note cards, send them up. I've received a few questions online. If you're online, please feel free to keep those questions coming. While you're doing that, I will ask one, maybe two questions of the panelists. And the first question really invites you all to elaborate on some things you've already started talking about, which is reform. How have recent events shaped your thinking about it? Nick talked about how the most minimalist reform might just be to ban mid-decade redistricting. We could also try to take steps to limit partisan gerrymandering more generally through independent commissions or redistricting criteria. Maybe we want to go bigger and shift away from single-member districts entirely. What do you all think about the possibilities of those? Are you more or less optimistic that reform is coming after what we've seen now? And what kinds of reforms do you think are likely to really be the most valuable, have the most bite for us? I don't really know what order we want to do this in. I guess, Sara, you spoke first before. Or should I give you the first crack at this?
Sure. Yeah. I'm curious to hear Nick and Michael's thoughts on this. Um, in California, we've been operating an independent redistricting commission to overwhelming success for two redistricting cycles now. It is my hope, and certainly the two pieces of legislation that we had hoped were moving forward back in 2021, 2022, are already written. They are absolutely there and available, ready to go whenever that moment arrives. But getting to that place, to that condition in which it's something that is actually passable and a president that will sign it. I don't know that we're there at this moment in time, but I think Nick had opened talking a little bit about the Gilded Age and the extreme redistricting that had occurred during that time period. But the period that followed the Gilded Age was the Progressive Era. And during that time period, we saw a host of good governance reforms, changes in primary elections, nonpartisan elections, various positions that moving to be voted on, removing party machines from the typical local politics play. It's possible that we are on the verge of such a moment. And I think when I participate and hear about the conversations about much larger reforms, whether that be about proportional representation or otherwise, it does certainly give me hope, because I think what I think most Californians felt in voting for Prop 50 was more so a referendum on the president as opposed to a referendum on independent redistricting. We had just passed an independent redistricting commission for the city of Los Angeles. Commissions are being used more and more throughout the local process. So I think, to me, a very minimal reform is to use independent redistricting in all 50 states to level the playing field across the nation, creates the conditions in which we can have more competitive elections in which voters can compete and truly choose the best candidate to represent their communities. And I think that it would be a place that I hope that we can get. I'm not sure that we have the conditions that are right for that kind of change yet, but I'm an optimist, so I'll remain hopeful that we can get there.
I will say, I think one of the takeaways for me, at least, of the last few years is that we have another problem in all of this, which is that the courts are not serving as honest brokers in the way that you would need. And as you think about reforms, you have to think about, okay, well, you can enact many great reforms, and the court's going to find ways to sort of undercut those. And you've seen the courts do this with the Voting Rights Act. You've seen the courts do it in any number of other ways. But I think, as you think about reforms, and all of these things are great, you do need to think about how you bulletproof it against courts themselves being sort of fairly partisan actors. I think that's important to do.
Great. I'll say a couple of things. So I think that the last couple of years, I think have affected my thinking about reform in two ways. One is that it's now, I think, really clear to people that the U.S. House of Representatives is a single body. It's not, 50 separate congressional delegations. And so when we think about fairness for the U.S. House, we need to think about that issue at the national level. We can't rely on sort of scattered centrifugal state level reforms because those aren't uniform and they create the possibility of gamesmanship, of unilateral disarmament. If we're going to fix the U.S. House, we have to do it, in one fell swoop at the national level. And notably, that's what every other democracy with single member districts has done to curb gerrymandering. The way that Britain and Canada and Australia got rid of gerrymandering was not through provinces reforming or states reforming or Wales reforming. It was the national parliament adopting Big Bang reform that just took away line drawing power for good from politicians and gave it to commissions. And so I think there's really no support for the idea that you can fix a national legislative problem with regional reforms. The second point is that the Supreme Court is hurtling toward a holding that race-conscious redistricting is usually, maybe always, unconstitutional. Calais might not be that case, but that seems to be the court's trajectory. And so I think we need to start thinking about modes of representation that will be effective, but also legally safe in a post-Calais world where there's either no Voting Rights Act or there's extreme suspicion of race-conscious redistricting measures. And so proportional representation has the huge advantage that it provides equal or greater levels of minority representation through completely race-neutral means, right? There's no carving race-conscious districts. You just adopt PR, and if voters are polarized along racial lines, the system will inherently produce proportional representation for minority voters. So I think PR has a really big selling point in a post-Calais world because of its race-neutral nature. Now, for a lot of Americans, PR seems like a bridge too far because we're so wedded to single-member districts. And so one other idea I would float would be thinking about lawsuits and remedies for vote dilution on nonpartisan and non-racial grounds. So since you can't directly make race relevant, potentially in a post-Calais world, you can imagine lawsuits for packing and cracking urban voters, or packing and cracking the poor, or less educated voters. There are lots of axes that are distinct from race, that are meaningful political cleavages. And if we enabled lawsuits along those grounds, we might get a good deal of the benefit of the Voting Rights Act, but again, through race-neutral means, and without abandoning single-member districts if people are completely wedded to those districts. So I'll float that as another possibility for reform.
And I just add, I agree with Nick on the importance of a national solution, and for one big reason, which is called the South, right? It really, the South, of course, has a lot of racial discrimination, a lot of sort of the problems in representation, particularly for communities of color, come out of the South. But really, it's also the South that sort of is driving this mid-decade redistricting. And it was the South that drove the mid-decade redistricting in the Gilded Age, right? Because the South back then was a solid bloc for Democrats. and that kept the House really, really close. And so you needed every advantage you could get, and doing mid-decade redistricting allowed you to do that. The South now is mostly a solid block for Republicans, and that also keeps the House really, really, really close. And that sort of it sort of motivates the mid-decade redistricting, because if without the South as part of the country, you have a Democratic House, you have a Democratic Senate. Kamala Harris wins the Electoral College handily, even while losing the blue wall states in Arizona and Nevada. And it's really a very different sort of country. And so you really have two countries joined together. And because the South is a solid block, it sort of keeps everything close and motivates that. So fixing gerrymandering, I think, is important. You fix the South, and the reality is that the South has changed many times in its history, but rarely without a federal assist. And this is likely going to be one of those times as well.
All right, thank you. So I now have an abundance of questions that have been submitted both in the room and online. Let me ask a question that combines the question that I was going to ask you with a couple of questions that I've been asked, and it kind of builds on something that Michael said a couple of minutes ago. You know, you have some skepticism of how the U.S. Supreme Court in particular has been handling redistricting cases. And I would just be interested in hearing a little bit more about the role of the courts. To what extent do we want to have to rely on courts to have a check on partisan or say race-based gerrymandering? Do you have more thoughts on how the Supreme Court has handled the most recent redistricting cases it got, the Texas case, the California case, the New York case that it just issued a stay in last week? And how does the performance of the U.S. Supreme Court compare to state courts? There are some state courts that are putting a check on partisan gerrymandering. Sometimes that's generating a backlash. One of the questions that we got online noted that the Utah Supreme Court has played an important role in trying to allow there to be one Democratic-leaning district in Utah. There aren't any now, but now the response to that from the Utah legislature has been to try to pack the court and reduce that court's authority. And so what is the proper role of state when you're dealing with this national problem? That was a bunch of questions, I realize.
Touch on a couple elements of those. I'll say that when it comes to curbing redistricting abuses in general, courts are not my preferred institution. I would rather have institutional reform and other kinds of reform that don't require us to rely on judicial intervention. So one nice finding is that states that use independent commissions have a lot less litigation, virtually no successful litigation against their district plans. And that's because once you take self-interested politicians out of the equation, you lose the whole impetus for redistricting wrongdoing, right? A properly designed commission is not going to engage in partisan or bipartisan gerrymandering. It's not going to engage in racial gerrymandering or racial vote dilution. And so all of those claims will fail if directed at a map produced by a decent commission. So I would rather just sideline courts by having a better redistricting process in the first place. Second point is, if you have a flawed process, and so you're getting maps that are gerrymanders of one kind or another, I'm sort of an old-fashioned Caroline Products, John Hart Ely political process theory fan. So in my mind, one of the absolutely most persuasive justifications for courts ever intervening is when there's been some kind of malfunction or blockage in the political process, and the political actors won't fix it because they're the ones who are responsible for the malfunction or the blockage. And so I think that Warren Court era rationale for courts stepping in is really, really powerful and almost perfectly justifies judicial intervention against gerrymandering. So for me, it's a real tragedy that our current court simply does not believe in the Caroline Products footnote 4 rationale for judicial intervention. After Rucho, I wrote an article called The Anti-Caroline Court, which sort of encapsulates my thinking on the current court. There were decades when political process theory motivated the thinking of the Supreme Court. That era is past. We have, an originalist court, a textualist court, a very ideological court, but this is simply not a political process theory court. So, to my real regret, the current federal judiciary just shows no interest in what I think is the best and most compelling theory of judicial intervention in this area.
I would, in general, if you can, stay away from courts, especially the federal courts right now. I do think a crucial part of democracy reform also probably involves court reform, term limits or other things that people have talked about. But right now, the courts, the federal courts, in particular the Supreme Court, do not play a helpful pro-democracy role. And in fact, they're very polarized and almost predictable, right? And in terms of what happens. And so I would stay away from that. I think state courts are a different thing, but it really varies from place to place.
Sarah, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I'm in agreement with both of the lawyers in the room.
All right. Well, let me ask a much more discrete question. You've talked about how at the national level, we may not really have a partisan asymmetry that emerges from this, but we may have a decrease in competition. And how might that ultimately shake out when we look ahead to the midterms? So someone pointed out that in midterm years, typically the out party does quite well, maybe picks up 24 or more seats in Congress. Is that still something that can happen? Or when you have gerrymandering to the extent that we have, do you just have so many safe seats that the margin, the number of seats that can shift one direction or the other is just smaller than it's been in the past? Does anyone have a sense of that?
Well, I think it depends on what you think the 2026 election looks like, right? I mean, like it could be an extraordinary tsunami type wave that could produce more, something that looks normal and healthy, right? Lots of seat shifting. But of course, like we shouldn't depend on needing a tsunami wave in order to affect change. Like the whole purpose of having elections every 2 years to the founding generation was, well, as the mood of the people changes, so should the composition of the House. And that was the idea. And, it doesn't sort of happen under normal circumstances. Remains to be seen what 2026 looks like, because there are lots of like moving dynamics, the war, lots of other things sort of going on that could affect that and could produce tsunami type circumstances. And in fact, like there are places like Texas where some of the gerrymanders could end up being dummy manders. Like, Republicans may not pick up all of the seats that they thought they were going to pick up, in part because, they, the essence of doing this is like you draw like districts that are a little bit closer, but they could easily get swamped. So,
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I mean, when we're comparing this to 2018 and the blue wave that came, especially for districts in California, the ones that flipped were highly, highly competitive races. So admittedly, there could be some sort of seawall, if you will, right, that protects against such a wave as we might know or think about it. And on balance, that is a challenge for voters in the long run. I think that was a part of your question as well, because I think it was Nick that pointed out this can leave a lot of voters with a bad taste of feeling like they lack representation in their state. But I think let's see what actually occurs in 2026 to be certain. It seems like there will, of course, be a whole lot of activism amongst Democrats nationwide. But that is also quite typical of the moment that we're in.
I'll say one quick thing on that. I mentioned the website PlanScore that I work on. One of the new features we're adding to PlanScore is a tool that lets you shift the national or the state level electoral environment by up to 10 or 12 points in either party's direction, and then look at how either a particular state's map or how the whole national House map would perform in that electoral environment. And when you do that, you see that if you move the dial toward the Democrats, anticipating a reasonable Democratic wave in 2026, you don't flip all that many seats from Republicans to Democrats. You do flip enough to flip the House from Republican to Democratic majority control, but you don't get nearly as many additional seats for Democrats as you would have in 2018, let alone the 1990s or the 1980s or 70s. And so that's just because we have substantially fewer competitive districts today. We don't have zero competitive districts. And so, some change in the national environment is enough to produce a modest change in the composition of the House, but it's not enough to produce the swings of 30, 40, 50 seats that we've seen in earlier decades.
So another question that sort of relates to the electoral dynamics that we might see. If you have fewer competitive districts, more safe districts, one of the questions points out that does tend to mean that a lot more of the action happens at the primary stage. And so, what have you seen? What do you expect to see in terms of where electoral competition is taking place? And are we likely to see more intra-party divisions and more high stakes battles, between Republicans or between Democrats than we are actually, come November between the parties?
Well, I think you already saw that in Texas this week. Dan Crenshaw, I think I would call the first victim of the mid-decade redistricting. He is a Republican congressman from a fairly conservative suburban district. He already had been attacked a bit before, but in the redraw, like he picked up a bunch of new voters and lost to a much more conservative Republican. And so I think, and that of course is the danger of gerrymanders when you don't have competitive seats. Everything gets decided in the primary. Primary electorates for both parties tend to be more to the extreme than the other, especially the Republican primary electorate. And so, and there's no sort of real check in the general election. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, one of the challenges is that, again, state by state primaries look quite different. So who is it that gets to participate in a primary? I think to Michael's point, you have real extreme differences in terms of the turnout for a primary. Here in California, we operate a top 2 primary, which if you're following our governor's race, some are even predicting that we could have 2 Republicans make it through our top 2 primary and end up with a Republican governor of California. Something I don't think anyone thought possible, given the overall vibe of the state. So I think how the structure of the primaries differs from state to state also makes a really big role in determining the outcomes of them. But yes, absolutely, that you see a lot more of that action happening at the primary stage. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, here in California, we see in some of the new districts, Republicans, 2 incumbent Republicans battling it out for one spot, ultimately. And so one of them will not be going back to Congress. Those are the kinds of dynamics that we're most certainly seeing here.
Great. Quickly say on that, the question connects to an ongoing project of mine that I call intra-partisan gerrymandering. So by that term, I mean when a faction within a given party tries to use redistricting to disadvantage another faction within the same party. So think of Tea Party Republicans trying to disadvantage moderate Republicans, or machine Democrats in Chicago trying to disadvantage reform Democrats in Chicago. So one point about intra-partisan gerrymandering is that it takes place almost exclusively in very safe areas, because the last thing a party wants to do is lose seats to the other party in an effort to gain seats for one intra-party faction at the expense of another intra-party faction. So if we see fewer competitive districts, fewer competitive jurisdictions in general, we may expect to see more intra-partisan gerrymandering. The other point I'll mention about intra-partisan gerrymandering is that the relevant election for that purpose is the primary election, right? Like the way that you benefit one faction and disadvantage another faction is by making sure that your preferred faction's candidates win nominations in the primary, and the other faction's candidates lose nominations in the primary. So when we talk about redistricting, we almost always focus on drawing district lines with an eye toward how they'll perform in the general election. But one thing that this intrapartisan gerrymandering project has made me think a lot more about is redistricting with an eye toward what happens in the primary election. And it kind of complexifies the process of redistricting. It's hard enough to draw district lines, but imagine doing so if you want to have certain outcomes in the primary, then followed by certain other outcomes in the general election. It turns redistricting into kind of like a two-stage project rather than a one-stage project.
Great. So I will try to sneak in one or two more questions, but before I do that, let me do my CLE duties. So for those of you who are attending virtually, if you wish to receive CLE credit, I will now give the passcode. Today's passcode is district. Again, today's passcode is district. That's DISTRICT. Case does not matter, and you should be able to access the form in the webinar.
Plural, right?
No, it's just singular.
Okay.
Just singular. Please don't confuse things. Okay, so I will ask this since we are in Wisconsin. Maybe this isn't a totally fair question since none of you are from Wisconsin, but you may or may not have seen that we have had some redistricting news in the state this week. The governor has made a proposal to amend the state constitution to try to do something about partisan gerrymandering. And the approach that he has proposed, and he's going to try to call a special session of the legislature to implement his proposal. It adds just 17 words to the state constitution in the section that addresses state legislative districting. It would say, quote, districts shall not provide a disproportionate advantage or disadvantage to any political party. Partisan gerrymandering is prohibited. Okay. And so do you have any initial reactions to the likely value of that kind of approach, whether that is a worthwhile sort of change to make, what the implications of that might be? I will just point out that there actually does seem to be some ambiguity about whether this change would apply just to state legislative districting or also to congressional districting. Right? There is that sentence that flatly says partisan gerrymandering is prohibited, but it is located in the section of the Constitution that addresses state legislative districting specifically. So any, again, this may be off the cuff, but any reactions to that proposal?
I mean, I think it's a worthwhile approach. I mean, I think it potentially gets you a lot of the way there. Of course, a lot will depend on having courts that will enforce it. And I think a critical question is whether you want to put a little bit more definition around some of this stuff. A few more than 17 words just to sort of make sure that courts understand what it is that they're doing. Because for whatever reason, courts oftentimes find this hard or try to find reasons to find it hard. But I think it is a worthwhile approach. It's not quite as robust as, say, moving to a commission, which requires, as in California, pan-partisan support. Like in California, you can't pass a map unless you have support from Democrats, Republicans, and independents. That, virtually ensures that the map is not going to be terrible. It may, people can debate whether it's the greatest map of all time or not, but it's not going to be terrible because, you're not going to pass an anti-Republican gerrymander if Republicans have to vote for it, right? And so a commission would be a more robust way to do this. This does depend on courts, which, as we know, sometimes are not great and sometimes change. But it is if this is something that can be done, I think it's worth exploring.
Yeah, I would also be sort of warmly positive about this. We've learned a lot about drafting effective anti-gerrymandering language over the last decade plus, and I don't think these 17 words are fully capitalizing on all the lessons we've learned over the last generation. when Michael and I were involved in some of the drafts for the federal legislation, it took us a lot more than 17 words to ban gerrymandering or to try to ban gerrymandering at the federal level. With a term like disproportionate, what does that mean exactly? Using which elections, presidential elections, legislative elections, a regression model, what? How much disproportionality are you allowed to have? What if there's a supposedly benign explanation for disproportionality, like political geography or incumbents performing well? There are a million sort of subsidiary questions that language could and should potentially try to address. And so I don't think this would be a sort of model of how to curb gerrymandering. Same time, with a sympathetic court, it might be all you need. So it's far better than nothing. But I would have lots of advice to give that would go beyond just those 17 words.
Yeah, but as I always tell people, like if you have a teenager who's failing in school and you can get them up to like a B minus or a B, you take that. It's maybe not an A plus, but like getting half the way there is better than being stuck at an F. So, but again, a lot does depend on the courts. I will say I applaud Governor Evers for his consistency on raising this issue through thick and thin, good times and bad times. He's not sort of changed on this, and so I do applaud him for his leadership on this.
And Sara, can we give you the last word?
Yeah, I'll just add. I mean, I agree. I mean, great first step, but there's definitely more that can be done. Here in California, it is written into our Constitution. Our commission cannot consider incumbency. We cannot look at where a current incumbent lives. We also cannot use partisan data, including voter registration. So we only base our lines on census data. We don't look at past elections. We're not looking at registration. None of those things are even taken into account. And I think those are better ways of getting to removal of partisan gerrymandering than just simply stating it, at least giving those who are in charge of drawing those lines something more specific and concrete.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you again so much to our panelists for this really fascinating conversation. And thanks to all of you for coming again on a dreary afternoon. I think that for those of you who are here in the room, we do have some refreshments if you want to stick around and chat with the panelists. For those online, no refreshments for you. Maybe next time. All right. Thank you again.